Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're beginning a new study today. We're going to be studying the concept of agape in the Old Testament. And you may protest, agape is a Greek word we know from the Greek New Testament. And of course, it is. It's perhaps the most important word in the New Testament because it defines God. 1 John 4:8, God is love. It defines our relationship with each other. John 13:33-35, we're to agape each other as Jesus has agaped us, and it defines what God feels for us and why Jesus died on the cross. John 3:16, God agaped the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son. So it is not just an important word in the Greek New Testament, but perhaps the most important word in the Greek New Testament. And the Old Testament, of course, is not written in Greek, it's written in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, there's only one word for love, like in English, and it is the word ahav. And so that word is given, you know, double, triple, quadruple duty in the Old Testament, meaning a variety of things, from whether or not Isaac preferred venison. Isaac loved his venison. Well, that's the same word that's used in Song of Solomon, that's used of the way Abraham felt about Isaac. So it does multiple duty, as does the word love in our language. The Greeks, however, had four words, and we'll talk about those words tomorrow. But what I want to talk about today as we get started and look at a variety of relationships in the Old Testament that are defined by agape, that New Testament word, is to explain how we can even do this study. And it is because sometime in the middle of the 3rd century BC, um, Ptolemy II, who was ruling from Alexandria in Egypt, and who was patron and sponsor of the great library of Alexandria, which is the greatest library the world had ever known to that point, and the second greatest library that has ever existed behind the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the Library of Alexandria. And it was the first truly modern library that sought uh, to encompass all knowledge, to collect all knowledge, and it was burnt to the ground by Julius Caesar's troops quite accidentally. Caesar was Julius Caesar was mortified that his troops had accidentally caused the burning of that library. But it was in its heyday in the middle of the 3rd century BC. And Ptolemy II summoned 70 or 72 scholars, Hebrew scholars, to the library in Alexandria because he wanted to commission them to make a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And of course, there are a lot of apocryphal stories about how each man worked separately and they produced their 70 or their 72 copies. And when they compared them, they were all identical. Lots of legends surround any kind of an endeavor like this. But it is true that there were 72 scholars who were collected and who were commissioned to produce a definitive Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. When you read about this as a reference book, when you're studying, sometimes it's called the LXX, which of course are the Roman numerals for 70, or sometimes it's called Septuagint, based upon Latin for 70, the Septuagint. And that's what the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is. And it was quite popular and well disseminated throughout the Mediterranean world. Not quite so much as the New Testament has been preserved, but almost. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament in Greek from the Septuagint. As you read along in the New Testament, there are times when it's clear folks who are speaking, or Paul as he's writing, or is quoting from the Septuagint. He's using that translation, not the old Hebrew. The bottom line is, by the 1st century, you know, young Jewish men went to Hebrew school to learn Hebrew, but in Palestine, no one spoke Hebrew in the streets. They spoke Aramaic. And everybody around the Mediterranean spoke Common Greek. The way people around the world continue to learn English today, and you can get around, in the Roman world, it was Koine Greek, it was Common Greek. And so we should not be surprised that this translation, the Septuagint, was widely disseminated and widely used around the Roman world, especially as in the first century before the fall of Jerusalem, um, Jews were making a lot of proselytes in the Roman Empire, something Jesus alludes to in Matthew 23. And those folks were not learning Hebrew, but they were reading the Old Testament in Greek from the Septuagint. In fact, the Septuagint was the oldest Old Testament text that we had until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948. Um, the oldest manuscripts in Hebrew before then were from like the 900s AD. They were medieval manuscripts, 900s, thousands, in the 11th and the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries are the oldest manuscripts that we had for the Hebrew Old Testament, but we had um, Greek texts for the Old Testament going back before the birth of Jesus. So they were the oldest texts, and until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, to the best of our knowledge, the most reliable text that we had for the Old Testament. So that's how you and I can talk about the use of agape in the Old Testament because of the production of the Septuagint in Alexandria, Egypt in the middle of the 3rd century BC. We'll talk about how those translators used that word and invested that word with meaning that would go on into the New Testament, meaning that it really didn't contain until they made their translation. We'll talk about that next time. And then we're going to look at some relationships that are defined by agape in the Greek Old Testament. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. We'll pick up there next time.